Any questions so far? Any questions, issues, problems? You've got an exam coming up a week from Monday. You've got your first essay, which will become available this Friday on the 5th. So pull down that assignment on Friday. Watch that movie this weekend. I think I told you last time, it's about a 3-hour-long movie. It's one of the early mass culture films. It's something every American saw. I'm going to talk a little bit about mass culture today. Your challenge, and I don't know, has anybody done film analysis before? Any? A little bit. What sort of thing did you do?
I took it from class in high school.
Okay. So you were looking for what in films?
Geez, that was a while ago.
It was a while ago, okay. Well, so what I'm going to be asking you to do is to look at this film in 2 different ways. And so you should be thinking about these lectures as helping you get there. One, it's a historical document, right? So it's something that came out of this era and expressed a whole lot of values about the era. And you want to notice that. 2, it pretends to be historical. And when you watch the story in the movie, you'll see it's a spin on the Reconstruction and the meaning of the Reconstruction. So I will want you to be thinking about both of those things as you watch the movie and then as you analyze it. How does this function as a historical document, 1919, what's it expressing, and how well does it do as a historical record? And why might that be good, or why might that be effective or not effective? And then, so that's due a week from this Friday, and then the exam is the following Monday. So we are in Unit 2, Lecture 2 now. I've changed the title somewhat from the syllabus. I'm calling this the Second Industrial Revolution. That's the right way to characterize the economic change that took place in this period of time. And we're going to look at the way in which mass production of materials led to mass manufacturing, which led to a mass culture, right, up into the 1920s. So we're running from the 1890s. 1890 we can say, but really 1890, 1896 to 1929. And 1929, why? Yeah.
Great Depression.
Economic change, the Great Depression collapse, and a whole new economy comes upon us. But this was a period of sustained growth, expanded wealth, and seemingly the pinnacle of modernism. Modernism was really working well, particularly in the cities. And so we've got a faded background here purposefully. In the background in America, those rural people, rural laborers in the mines, rural farmers, weren't brought along on this and were dropped out of it early. They tried to get political power in the 1890s. They were unsuccessful. They will continue to be on the margins of this more modernizing society through this whole period. So as I talk about the changes that take place, recognize that they're not taking place in rural America, right? They're taking place in urban America. Let's just remember where we are. Well, first, I want to go back for a second. Let's just remember for a minute the last economic unit, okay? And the first economic story we told from the last unit was about, and I asked you about this last time, but I don't want you to miss it. It was about an industrialization based on fossil fuel. It was about an exponential growth in energy, making possible an incredible growth in productivity. And so it was about harnessing this energy to have more raw materials, more steel and rails, more timber, pre-cut lumber, more cattle and beef, more wheat and flour, and all of that drew more labor. So the technologies didn't replace labor, they made labor more efficient. And ultimately, as we'll see in this, allowed us to differentiate and simplify labor. So as we move into the second unit, we see the economy undergo another transformation of that kind. And this is why we call it the second industrial revolution. Now let's look at ourselves, economic, the second unit in advancing the modern. So in the advancing the modern, last time we saw the way in which lands which were public suddenly became refined as part of an environmental management state, forest lands with conservation values placed on them by the nation state. We looked at the city and the environmental challenges there and the way in which there was a gendered response to that. And we saw how the automobile almost destroyed Western public lands and led to the idea of wilderness. Those are the three big ideas last time. This time, we're going to look at the economic changes that took place in that same context. And alongside and parallel those things, but particularly in the cities. Intensified management we see, like an intensification of all of the materials and all of the production. Let's start here. Anybody know who that is? Thomas Edison, right? We all recognize Thomas Edison. He's an American hero. And if we didn't recognize him at first, the light bulb gives him away, as does his name on the company that's there. So we associate Thomas Edison with the light bulb, right? This is what we understand his invention, the light bulb. Why was the light bulb so important?
Hey, Kip.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't think that the Zoom slideshow is moving at the same pace as the one in class.
You're not looking at Thomas Edison?
No, we're still on the title slide.
Oh dear. Good to know. Okay, hang on one second. So while I'm getting this fixed, let me see, this says what I'm sharing. What's important about the light bulb? Okay, change the raw material. I'm going to stop sharing for a second here. Let me start sharing. Anything else? Extend your workday, right? So artificial nighttime, how's that?
That's good. We're looking at Thomas Edison now.
Okay, so that, and you are too, and I don't know why I'm seeing what I'm seeing, but let me see if I can just change it. I can't. Let me figure out how to get to this. It's not going to do it for me. Okay, you're looking at Thomas Edison, but I can't see him on my own screen here. Let's see. Okay, that shows there. Okay, good, I can change it. I can't see it, but I can change it. All right, so light at night, different energy source, and the light bulb. We often say the light bulb, but it really wasn't the light bulb that Edison invented, right? The light bulb was just an incidental part of the real invention that he brought forward. It was so much less important, in fact, than what he did put together, which was the very first electrical delivery system, electrical generation system, right? It was the system that he was inventing. The light bulb was incidental to it, and he figured out how to make the cheapest light bulb because he was thinking about how will I put the right materials together to get electricity out to households, right? Now, we take it for granted today, but the idea that you could harness and direct electricity from a central source and run that power out across vast spaces for anybody to use, brand new. It's brand new in the 1880s. It's a brand new system. It's a brand new delivery of energy. And that's what Edison invented. That's what he piloted, was, is it possible to get electricity out there? And Edison gets all this credit, and you're looking at, if you notice those crosshatches, that's it. That's the delivery system of the Pearl Street station in 1883. The area that you see was wired with copper wire, running from generators. All of the buildings inside of it had electrical wires running up into them. What do you do with electricity in an age when electricity has just arrived? Well, the only thing it's been invented for, lights. So they had lights, they had electric lights. That's all electricity could be used for. So just this tiny 16-block area serviced with a single direct current. And if you know anything about electricity, that's wicked dangerous. So it was small, it was novel, It was really dangerous. It could kill you if it hit the wires. But Edison gets credit for putting this out on the landscape and saying, okay, something like this is possible. And what he put together, so this is the Pearl Street station itself. That's the outside view and the inside view. We can say marked the pinnacle of the industrialized natural resource extraction economy. And it pointed towards the future that we're moving towards all at once. The future of a mass production economy. So just like fossil fuels, we argue, historians argue, the energy available from fossil fuels was so significant, that was an energy revolution. The energy available because of electricity was so significant that we have at least a major energy transition that takes place at this point. Maybe not a revolution, but close to a revolution. It starts to change everything, right? So, and what are we doing there? We're harnessing the coal energy. What you're looking at when you're looking at the picture on the left is the inside of the Pearl Street station, which is basically a giant coal-fired power plant. You can see men on the first and second floor emptying wheelbarrows of coal into the boilers, which are turning those 6 giant generators that you see on the top. It's a giant steam engine with generators connected to it, right? So it's the old kind of energy, but it's transforming it into an energy that can be delivered anywhere. That doesn't get locked geographically, right? That can make you more nimble in how you use your energy in particular places. So it's turning coal energy, which was solar energy, into electrical energy and sending it out for people to have lights at night. And you can see on the right side, that was an advertisement for it. So those 3 stacks, there were 4 of them, don't have the black sooty smoke that was coming out of it, but this thing generated smoke 24 hours a day as it generated electricity. So these are iron and steel ovens in a steel reinforced building with fossil fuel energy and then copper wires for conductivity. Iron, coal, copper. Now, why copper? You know why copper was needed for the wires?
Has good conductivity and is cheaper than gold.
Bingo, both of those, you hit it on the head. So there are more conductive metals in nature, gold and silver. Copper is next, they're related to each other, and it's got to do with the electron on the outer band of the atom itself. Copper is pretty conductive though, and it's cheap compared relatively to gold and silver. So you need copper to make this whole system go. And there is a ton of copper inside of those generators. Like a generator is basically this huge tangle of copper with an iron magnet spinning around it. And that's what's getting the electricity going. And you need all that copper to run this service area. So Edison piloted this copper, so this is iron, coal, and copper system in 1883, 1884. And we actually have to ask ourselves why it took so long. Why did it take so long for this? It's just iron and copper and coal, right? All of the elements for the Pearl Street station in terms of knowledge and material were present as early as the 1830s. Electricity had been known and had been captured in lots of ways and harnessed since the late 18th century, right? We'll remember in our 1840s that the United States had access to enormous amounts of coal from the 1840s forward. And by the 1880s, these deposits are being exploited faster than ever. Most of it being used to smelt steel or to move locomotives. But there's plenty left over for electricity. And there will be once electricity comes. We'll also remember iron deposits, right? Found these in the 1840s as well, close enough to Lake Superior to get this into the national market. There'd long been more than enough iron to build the generators and to build the irons. So why so long? One factor, and it was the copper. The cost of copper was too expensive to afford electrification until 1883. The copper that came out of Lake Superior came out of the ground pure, which meant it's most conductive, but it required enough processing in place and then transshipment elsewhere that it was at about 22 cents a pound. It cost too much to be affordable. And we know actually that this was Edison's big question because he started tracking copper prices in his research notebook in the 1870s. And he knew if copper got below 12 cents a pound, the Pearl Street station was affordable. But until then, it was too expensive. You couldn't pay for it. You couldn't afford it. So he tracks this through the 1870s. Copper is around 18 to 22 cents. But out in the far west, as we well know, this is all about to change. So we remember that gold mining first and then industrialized hard rock mining settled the far west. We're looking at Butte, Montana right now. And Butte is really emblematic of the big mining towns of the far west. It had been discovered in the 1860s as a gold rush placer mining center. There, 1862, so the middle of the war. These are actually border state men who didn't want anything to do with the Civil War. They came out to Butte, Montana to kind of escape the war, and they found gold and mined gold. But it didn't take them long to notice that up along the hills there are these black rock protrusions, ores they didn't recognize, they couldn't identify, but clearly large deposits of ores that should be valuable in some way. And by the 1870s, a number of hard rock companies had discovered this was silver ore that could be crushed down, easily amalgamated, and then shipped out of Butte. So by the early 1870s, the Butte Silver District suddenly became world renowned, shipping wagon carts full of silver bullion south down to Salt Lake City, Utah, and the Transcontinental Railroad there. But the silver wasn't going to be its treasure. The silver was an ore sitting on top of this much more complicated ore underneath, which was rich in copper. And it was the richest copper ever found in an ore form on Earth. It was about 40% copper in the ore. Nobody ever seen that in an ore lode itself. And by 1878, the companies that had invested the most in the silver transformed themselves into copper companies because they realized they had a whole lot of value down there. So a couple men, Marcus Daly and I'm forgetting the other man there, invested in major smelters that were able to reduce it to about a 90% copper. And they started in 1878 shipping wagon loads of nearly pure copper down to the railroad. It started arriving in New York City. When that ore arrives in New York City, the Michigan men go, okay, we're in trouble here. We've got a competitor on our hands. And so they do what big business owners did in that point in time. They started a price war. They started driving down the price. So Butte started to get into this game in 1878. By 1881, a railroad spur is built from Salt Lake City up to Butte. Transcontinental hasn't made it. By the time the Transcontinental Railroad gets made, and this is the Montana State House in Montana, former President Ulysses Grant drove the Golden Spike there. By the time that happened, it was clear that Edison knew there was a flood of copper coming from the east and the prices were about to plummet. And plummet they did. So Michigan first, these are our two copper giants. Michigan first drove down that price because they could afford to drive it down and hold their industry at that, thinking that they were going to drive Montana out of business. But the Butte producers already had the railroad connection, and they had more ore than the Michigan producer were ever going to be able to see. And so they also had the advantage of open ground, so they could build smelters as big as they needed to. And they started building bigger and bigger smelters. Several companies, in fact, established these largest in the world hard rock mining operations connected to what started to become mass ore processing. Let's get as much ore through as we can to keep that price low, tons of copper a day, and mass ore movements and economies of scale and the railroad, so that by 1883, Montana's cutting the prices. They're in a position where they can afford to go even lower than Michigan. And so we see this through the 1880s. Overproduction, drive the price down. You got to recover your cost by producing more. In the end, neither one of the producers lost their market share, but they successfully drove the price down temporarily to a pretty low in 1883, the year that Edison afforded and could afford to build the Pearl Street station. Now we can see that the price of copper generally continues to rise after that period. So demand increases, but production grows exponentially. And we can see this in our chart on copper. So you can see where Montana adds to Michigan. Michigan is the bottom line there. This is after 1880. And you can see the blue of Montana almost immediately outpacing the Michigan output. Arizona joins shortly thereafter, but only with a mere pittance, a small share. But together, by 1885, the far west is outproducing Michigan. And it's going to continue to grow from there. It will never look back. This acceleration of output, which was exponential for a while, flooded the eastern markets with an abundance of copper. There was more copper on hand than people had ever seen at prices they'd never experienced. And again, we can see there were actually in this period of time, because the prices were so low, the biggest guys tried 4 different times to get that price back up. So the Secretan, Amalgamated, in World War I, each of these were monopoly attempts to get this copper back up. So Secretan and Amalgamated were both efforts where financiers bought all the copper stocks in the world and then held them off the market to try to create scarcity and drive the price up, which they did. Each of those efforts were illegal monopolies, and they were broken up. World War I was when the federal government said, we're going to war and we'll pay for copper, whatever the price happens to be. And so they created an open market in a war environment, which made them the monopoly buyer, and again, drove the price back up. But we see it falls again after World War I, and it never recovers, right? It was driven down to its sort of natural place in our economy around 10 cents, 11 cents. And that's until recently what we afforded through this whole century. And we can see as well, let's just look at the whole 20th century, that copper production output grew at an exponential rate through the early 20th century, and then continued to grow. Output continued to grow throughout the whole 20th century. There are dips and there are fallbacks, but the trend is upward until the 21st century. More copper each year than was produced the year before. And just to kind of put in scale what the 20th century looked like, that's the chart from the earlier page of the 18th century. That's the 1880s takeoff. It just picks up from there. So enormous outputs in the 20th century, unprecedented. And except after the Great Depression and World War I, every year it's grown. And that's a remarkable accomplishment in itself, right? Just to be able to create an economy that grows its output every year. What's more remarkable about this is the ore that was being processed was of a lower grade every year as well. So miners had to work less and less valuable ore to get more and more and more copper out of the ground. We'll get to that in just a minute. Let's go back to the acceleration again for just a second. And I want to think for a minute about the cause and effect here between technological change and material abundance, and think about electrification. We usually hear that it was the genius of Edison inventing the light bulb that created this new technology, electrification, that led to a new demand for copper. And that the reason why we have this exponential growth in the West is because Americans are electrifying. And so they demand that copper. And the West and even the East are just responding. But here's what we know. Pearl Street Station was an unmitigated disaster. It was inefficient. It was expensive. It's had direct current, so it was superbly dangerous, fatal, limited in its coverage, and it was designed not to be able to grow. right? This was almost a failure out the door. And so Pearl Street and the electric light didn't take off in the 1880s. Domestic electrification, in fact, doesn't happen until the 1920s. So Edison's vision doesn't happen as soon as he creates the Pearl Street station. In fact, this just goes to waste. It gets shut down, it stops in use. And instead what we see, so it goes back to the question of, well, if there wasn't any electrification in the 1880s and early 1890s, why was copper output growing so fast? And what we find is it's actually internal momentum of these copper companies themselves. It's the sunk costs that are going into getting more and more ore into that growing volume of copper. It's the dynamic of industries like this. This is the Washoe reduction works that belong to the Anaconda Copper Company. Just to recover the investment of something like this, they had to mine exponentially more ore. And we see the companies do this multiple times through the late 19th century. That is, the ore gets a little bit lower grade. They have to build an exponentially larger processing facility. And the cost of that means they have to process even more ore. So it's a supply-driven growth that's going on here. They're pushing copper out faster than the demand exists, right? And this scale that we see here was pretty common by the early 20th century across the West. And again, I'll talk about why in just a moment. But for now, I just want us to note that economically speaking, until the middle 1890s, copper production and iron production and all these other metal productions were being driven by a supply side push. There were these industries that had achieved these economies of scale, and they put enormous amounts of material into our economy. Lots and lots of inexpensive copper and iron and coal and timber, materials galore. And every year more than the year before, right? This is what this economy was developing. Now, all of that cheap copper made electrical systems affordable if you could find the right system to invest in. And we'll remember from last time that it was horse transportation dirtying the cities was replaced and displaced in the 1890s by this gradual investment in the electrical streetcar, right? This led to improved sanitary conditions in cities. And it was done partly in response to that and partly because of the novelty of the new technology. But as soon as electric streetcars started to go in, every city wanted that, right? They started sprouting like weeds, and the streetcar transportation industry sort of emerged as this brand new industry in the United States. There was plenty of coal and steel to do this because of the Western supply of copper. There was also now plenty of electricity. And so cities invested, and cities and individuals, they welcomed investors sometimes they built them themselves. And they suddenly, in urban centers around the United States, created this renewed demand for steel, rails, renewed demand for the kind of construction that had gone into our railroads. And they spawned the mass production of electric engines and the trolley cars themselves. We can see in the upper right the kind of whole streetcar system. So it includes not just the cars and the rails, but also timber for the electrical poles, and then the steel for the structure itself. And then we can see that's actually where the motor mounts. That's the ubiquitous electric motor, which will find itself all over the economy after the 1890s. And so streetcar systems began to lace their way throughout urban America. They were, for any city, the mark of being a thoroughly modern culture. You were there, you'd arrived. And in fact, the fact that streetcars were displaced by the automobile by the mid-century is a remarkable technological replacement story that wasn't foregone, because the streetcar was people's transportation of choice. We even had streetcars in Mansfield. Every city had them. They were everywhere. They were considered part of what you did. And in this way, electric streetcars put these human-scaled railroads into all of our urban places, cleaned them up, right? They reduced the unsanitary animal waste, created a new boom in the economy, demand for iron and steel, and copper in the 1890s, just as it seems like that economy is collapsing, right? This comes in and creates this demand. It also did something else. It created the engineering expertise to develop effective large-scale electrification systems, right? By the late 1890s, this is a system in San Pedro, California, right? This is not Edison's Pearl Street station any longer. It's a complex movement of electricity, the ability to move it in particular ways and understand it within the system. It led one to this broad knowledge in electrification, which gradually gets domesticated, but also the streetcar itself as an item, as a thing on the landscape, created this really interesting inversion of the technological imagination, and it transformed manufacturing. So we're looking at Henry Ford's Model T assembly line. Electricity made the assembly line possible, right? It's the electrification itself, right? Because electricity can run from one single generator out on multiple wires. And unlike the kind of limitations, the mechanical limitations of a steam engine or a water wheel, you can power electric lights, you can power hand tools, you can power small motors, and you can run that central assembly line all from the same generator. It allows you to disperse power in brand new ways. And so the knowledge of electrification made making a plant like that much easier. The other way the streetcar contributed was by the way it existed on the landscape. And in a sense, it gave Henry Ford, and he talks about this, watching streetcars and imagining how they might be built if you ran them down their own tracks, right? And essentially, this is a streetcar line running through the middle of the factory on which the automobile is assembled, right? His assembly line is just a streetcar line. And the car is just the streetcar getting put together in that way. It's something else as well, though. So Henry Ford, like Edison, we kind of think of as this inventive genius. But he, like Edison, wasn't so much an inventive genius as he recognized the material conditions in which he could invent. He recognized that he was in an industrialized world where something like an assembly line was even possible, right? We'll just look at his own trajectory. So Henry Ford, when he first started, when he made his first demonstration Model T4, he made it in that shed, and it took him months and months and months to put it together. By the early 20th century, he was churning out hundreds of them a day, right? And at the center of this, and this is what Ford and some of the other inventors recognized, was that growing out of the electrical transition and the industrialized Western resources was an energy revolution that made possible this second energy revolution. So we're looking at the internal combustion engine. This is a thing of beauty, right? This is an engineering feat. So we just think about the mechanics of it. Single piston, right, with a two-stroke engine. The energy of the engine itself puts that electricity back into the battery. The spark fires off so the way Henry Ford invented the Ford was there were no gas stations at that point. He imagined every owner would distill their own alcohol. It would burn anything. You could burn anything in the first Model T engine. And it was able to capture its own energy and then move things along. The internal combustion engine was a thing of genius, and it would come to dominate the 20th century. It's come to dominate the 21st century, unlike any invention ever in the history of humankind. But it was premised on an abundance of material. So what you're also looking at is a metallurgical wonder as well, an abundance of material and resources being available on a regular fashion, right? So all of those different parts of the engine are not the same piece of metal. They're not the same kind of metal. They have different requirements, right? You've got metal in there that needs to be able to be conductive. You've got metal in there that needs to be able to pull heat out of the air. You've got metal in there that needs to withstand explosive shocks because it's blowing up every few seconds. You've got metal that has to have tensile strength. You've got metal that needs to have tensile elasticity. All kinds of needs, which are not going to come from just pure iron or pure copper. It comes from a combination of those in alloys and the ability to manage that material. So it was only possible in an economy that had a huge volume and a huge variety of metals and alloys produced for mass mining and smelting. And in fact, we can see the mass movement towards material in all of our metal industries. We'll start with gold. This is gold production to the present, but the circled area shows the 1890s through the 1920s. What do you notice compared to the earlier era? There's more. There's a boom in the output of gold at the beginning of the 20th century. How did that happen? What we know is the first run through the West had actually drained all the creeks. Every single creek had been mined through, and it had opened a few hard rock gold mines, but it was hard to make hard rock gold mine pay. There was nothing new found in the West that led to this. There wasn't a single new claim that was discovered out there, no new finds. It was all technological. What a number of engineers realized, I realized this when I was researching my book on gold mining, was that placer mining wasted about 50% of the gold that was available, which means those tailing piles in those creeks were still gold mines. If you could move enough material to get them out. Now, I don't know if anybody sees, I don't know if it's Discovery or the History Channel, but there are gold miners today who are working the same process in places where they can get just a few jarfuls of gold because of its price. It's worth it. There it was a technological investment, right? At least half of it left behind in those tailing piles to be processed if you could get industry out there. And so these enormous dredges, in fact, Harvard University was a major investor in getting this a lot of this gold out. It started the basis of their huge endowment that they have today. But it was the same amount of gold in, let's go back to this one. It was the same amount of gold in 20 years that gold miners, placer miners had taken out in 45 years. It was a sudden influx of species when we're on the gold standard, right? So this boom of gold, like it did in the 19th century, is going to encourage the kind of investment we see in our mass production economy. Coal is the source for all raw material production, and we see this increasing use of coal also in electrification as the 20th century comes. And we see an accelerated output, right? More and more coal. A leveling in the 1920s, we might just notice. Why might coal level off in the 1920s? It didn't quite recover from the war, but less, in the meta sense, fewer trains, more automobiles, right? So that's sort of the maximum use of coal in a modern electrified economy with automobiles involved. And so when we see the replacement of the train and the streetcar with the automobile, we see a kind of a lower use of coal, but then acceleration again into the end of the 20th century. This was also mass production in the mines taking place. So there's those electric motors, right? If you could put an electric train into the mine, you could be more efficient. Variations of streetcars, in a sense. And so you move more men and more material and more coal, right? You've automated all of this and you increase your output and your scale of output. No industry grew quite like iron. We can see it just accelerating into the 20th century. The metals-based world is going to be built around and on iron. Iron comprises 95% of the metal and all of the metal in everything in our industrialized world. Copper comes second, it's about 3%. Lead is third at 1%, and all the rest of the other alloys and metals make up the remaining 1%. Dominated by iron. And iron output as a result grew faster than any other metal. And it did so in the face of diminishing quality of ores, lower and lower grade ores. And so we can just see this in the late 19th century, as late as 1890s, ore was still being mined from these ore faces by horses and carts, right? Open face mines, they'd haul it off to the processing center. So the output is limited by organic energy at place in the mine. With the onset of internal combustion engines and the power to run steam shovels and dump trucks, the iron industry increases and is capable of increasing the scale of excavation, hauling, moving more ore faster. And we see this continue into by the late 1920s. All of the rich surface deposits of iron ore have gone. They've been mined out. And the mining companies are going hard into the ground to get a lower grade ore, more of it than ever, to get a larger amount of iron output. And they literally removed the entire surface of the ground and then began by the 1920s working their way down into these enormous pits, with the ore being a lower and lower grade as they went. So the push in the industry that was most important was, how do you get more ore processed to keep that ore growing at the center of invention? Copper faced the same problem. Although we see exponential growth in the 20th century, it appeared to a lot of the copper owners in the early 20th century that we were going to run out of copper. So places like Butte, they mined out everything in like 20 years. All of that 30% ore, and then 20% ore, and then 5% ore, and then 2% ore, and they were down to a less than 1% ore in the early 20th century. There was no growth value whatsoever in the Michigan copper. And Arizona and Utah, while we knew they had copper deposits, it was less than 1% copper in these vast, enormous stretches of land. But you can see clearly that copper output grew exponentially. And again, there were no new deposits found. This was another technological innovation, something you've probably never heard of, called flotation. Chemists realized in the late 19th century that the conductivity of copper and the energy of oily bubbles could actually be put together to refine this copper. These are some of the delicious landscapes that flotation leaves behind. 99%, more than 99% of what comes into the factory goes out the waste chute, but basically really simple, like you might have done in your bathtub, right? You shake up oil and water and you pour in pulverized ore. The rock and the dirt, which doesn't have any electrostatic charge, falls to the bottom. Copper sticks to the bubbles. You scrape off the bubbles and you send it off to be smelted elsewhere. It saved American copper, this simple little device. It allowed us to go back into our ores and into places where we had copper that seemed to have no value whatsoever and squeeze the value out of it. And except for our economic collapses, we continued to squeeze that copper out of lower and lower grade ores across the 20th century. The most important and sort of unheralded part of this are these alloys. And so this has some of the key alloys that come when you start to mine on that scale. You find other metals in your ores and other alloys. And so these are a residual of the mining of the large metals, but they're critical. So we couldn't have fought World War I or we couldn't have had an industrial revolution without manganese added to iron, tungsten, chromite, zinc, and then these are metals that you add to copper to give them particular tendency. Small, tiny amounts of alloy metals that increasingly are a part of this manufacturing process. If you're going to make a Ford engine, you need the metals to behave exactly the way your engineers want them to. You can't do it without alloys. And you can see, so this just shows zinc, but all of the alloys follow the same trend. Exponential growth coming into the 20th century, getting absorbed into this growing materials economy. And this sheer abundance of all of these metals is what made this thing of beauty possible. This doesn't happen without mass production in the mines first. And this then happens, and all of the variations that follow continue to be dependent on that ongoing production, right? If you're going to have 1 million cars, You got to be doing a lot of mining, getting a lot of iron. So we like to credit Ford with the assembly line, but like I said earlier, like Edison, without this abundance of surplus material available to fabricate all of the complicated parts, all the complicated engine designs, the idea of an assembly line would have been absurd. The idea of having enough parts to make 10,000 cars in one place would have been absurd. There wasn't that much material, right? But once the materials were in place and fabrication got underway, the pieces could be delivered and positioned and assembled, and you could make cars like they grew on trees. Ford did, right? His first year manufacturing, 1909, he made 10,666 Model Ts. 10 years later, he was churning out 500,000 cars a year. 4 years later, he reached his peak of Model T production, churning out 2 million cars a year. And he would churn out 2 million cars a year through the 1920s, 1923 to 1927. Cars like they're growing on trees, goods like they're a natural product, right? This is what mass production gives us. This abundant natural resource from the manufacturing and the flexibility that electrification provided for the assembly line gave birth to the automobile, right? And it transformed manufacturing. It transformed the way we made stuff for ourselves, which in turn transformed the character of consumption in the United States. It changed us. It turned us into a consumer society. And let's look a little bit at that. The abundance of materials that were there encouraged people like Ford and Edison, and there are lots of people, to invent things, right? To get things that could be consumer items. And so it encouraged new inventions, just the sheer abundance of it. And let's look at two of the sort of most iconic of the inventions that were mass produced in the 1910s and 20s, the automobile and the radio. And they revolutionized both transportation and communication. These become emblematic of this new consumer society, and they lead the way for the patterns that this new society is going to provide. So both of them, and we're going to look at it a little bit, these singular technologies spawned whole new ecosystems of economic activity, and they both contributed very strongly to the rise of mass culture and a sort of mass identity of Americanness. Let's start. Ford kind of got this all started. About 5 years after his assembly line began, he made a radical move in 1914. Workers in industries across America have been arguing for a fair wage for a really long time. But Ford suddenly announces, I'm going to pay my workers $5 a day. Ford Planner, that's the $5 a day. This is more than the unions were asking for in the industries. It was unheard of. It would be like paying someone starting today at $18.50 an hour, right? Who had no skills whatsoever. So why did he do that? Why did Ford suddenly start paying his workers a more than reasonable wage? Yes, ma'am.
So they stay like working there? So you can always have workers?
So part of it was he wanted them to stay, but that wasn't all of it.
Bring in more workers.
It did tend to attract the best workers, and he was very much about having control over his workers.
His cars would be more efficient.
So he could trust the workers. Probably part of it too. But there was something else too.
His workers can buy his cars.
Bingo. It put them in a high enough income level so they could qualify for the financing to buy themselves, to get the credit to buy themselves a Model T, right? It provided them enough income to go into debt to their own company, buying the thing that they built. In this weird sort of way, Ford figured out I could pay myself by paying their salaries a little bit higher. I can float my own business in this way. And it worked wonders. I mean, one, yeah, it did. It attracted a loyal workforce. It was more money than ever. And Ford workers bought cars, right? They drove cars and they made them more popular. And cars really very quickly through the late 19 teens became the sort of choice of urbanites. People loved them, began to adopt them as quickly as they could. We saw last time, one of the major things that people did was to go out auto touring and auto camping. It was the most popular thing for people to do with cars besides visit family. And so we see people start to engage the automobile. But once you start to use an automobile, it starts to raise other questions. We lived in a nation that was built for railroads and horse transportation. And so it was really clear by the early 1920s that like we didn't actually have a landscape ready for cars. And we begin to see coming out of all of the major cities this cry for good roads, roads that will connect cities to cities, roads that will make it possible to drive in inclement weather. Roads for this growing technology that everybody wants to use, but couldn't use to accommodate cars. And who's supposed to pay for roads? Ford? No, this was a new call on the federal government and the state governments. This is a public interest to get these roads out. And they were there in response to the car. Ford's dream of making every car drive on alcohol also never materialized. People didn't want to distill their own alcohol for their car. They just wanted to drive their car. So there was this sudden demand for fuel as well, gasoline. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company adapted its refineries from kerosene to gasoline. This made his fortune, and several other oil companies that produce gasoline appeared, and they would put themselves along the roads, right? The gasoline at that point, lead was added to it because it gave a cleaner burn. There was so much lead from the abundant culture. The presence of so many automobiles spawned this drive-in automobile vacation visitor amenity tourist-like culture. And this is when it first appears, this kind of tourism as an industry. And so we can think about the roads and the demand for roads, fuel and the demand for fuel stations all along the roadway, and this growing tourist industry as these economies that Henry Ford didn't think about being part of the automobile. But once humans engaged in the automobile, they became part of the culture itself. Car culture, and then really mass culture, right? Everybody has a Model T. Henry Ford quipped, people can get a Model T in any color they want as long as it's black. They were all the same color. But there was gradually this desire for different kinds of cars, right? So the presence of the technology spawns these ecosystems and everybody participates in them, in what we might call mass culture. We can see a similar thing happening with the radio in slightly different ways. It's emblematic of the communication technologies of the age. Radio technology was perfected in World War I, but it kind of moved out into first hobby culture and then gradually mass culture. And it began to show its abilities around baseball, and in particular, the World Series. The World Series of 1922 was the first nationally broadcast event. And it became so popular and was so popular by 1924, the President of the United States was throwing out the baseball at the first World Series game because it was a national event. And it was the radio that made it this national event, that made it into this mass culture, this shared experience where we've all invested in the same thing, even though we live in different places. Or we all know the same stories because we've followed them in the same way. So I give you a couple of contemporary examples. Ross and Rachel, what am I talking about? Anybody know? Friends, the show Friends. Jim and Pam, The Office, right? So we've all shared in this. We know those stories, right? That begins in the 1920s with this communication technology, with these mass-produced technologies where we all began sharing in a similar culture. Or who's playing this weekend? Chiefs in the box, right? Super Bowl. Most people, right? It's one of the most watched events in the United States still. So shared culture, right, which comes through communication and technologies. So the mass culture begins in the mass production. Well, it begins out in the mines with the mass production of raw materials. And then it transforms into mass manufacture on the mass production line. But even when you make a lot of goods, you've still got to get them out there to the public, right? They've got to be sold to the American people. And so we see this with the radio. The radio first was produced and then sold as this kind of hobby device, right? Like, you know, dad can play with this thing and maybe pick up some obscure broadcast somewhere. Same kind of entry with the personal computer as well. It was first kind of brought in as a hobby device, right? But then gradually companies realized that there's more to be had here, that there's eyes, ears on this device, more and more eyes and ears on the device, and they can produce radio shows that will attract listeners, right? So the World Series was the first sign that this was possible, but then they realized they could put vaudeville on radio and radio news, and they found out that regularly produced radio shows attract more listening. And so the radio companies got hip to this, the broadcast companies got hip to this. And by the late 1920s, radios become fixtures in middle-class houses. And radio listening was, at least for a time, a social event. Like we sit around and watch television or go to a movie. Speaking of movies, and this was even probably the most attractive of the mass culture technologies of the age, is the invention of the rise of moving pictures or movies. Again, it started as a kind of a hobby with inventors and then a gimmick. It's kind of cool to see sometimes in a vaudeville show. But by the end of the 1920s, a whole industry will have grown in Hollywood, an entertainment industry that produces movies and that produces movie stars. Charlie Chaplin was big in this area. And movie houses are producing films that are watched in cities across America, right? Mass culture. Everybody saw Don Juan in 1926. Everybody. They knew the story, right? Everybody's seen Star Wars. We shared culture, shared stories, right? And the feature film and the movie star become even more popular by the end of the 1920s than the radio star even had been. And movies were more affordable even than any of the other devices. Anyone, even working class people, flocked to them just as much as middle class people. And so Americans began sharing the same stories and entertainment, right? Creating this mass culture, the same news. It's like sharing the same experiences, right? Like we're all reading the same book, we're all watching the same movie, we're all telling the same stories, we're having the same experiences, even though we're in different places. And this even begins to take place in domestic consumption. Mass production, mass culture spread into supermarkets as well, food and the produce system. Here, this was great, vast vertical integration. Financiers would buy out a whole bunch of mom and pop groceries, group them together and brand them, put a name on them, Piggly Wiggly, A&P, right? These are precursors to Kroger and Walmart, right? And inside of them, they're increasingly selling their own name brand on the oats and on the beans and on the other thing. Brands that distinguish their supermarket company from a different supermarket company selling exactly the same produce under a different brand, right? So branding starts to become important, and brand awareness. We see branding emerge strongly around the companies that produce the electricity and electronics. So Westinghouse and General Electric were electric companies, but then as domestic electrification took hold in the urban America in the 1920s, they started making other things that plugged in, right? So the General Electric, the Westinghouse toaster we see there. They made electricity, and they made radios, and they made radio broadcasts, and they made toasters, so we begin to see how some of the larger companies invest into the whole ecosystem that's being created. And branding becomes so important in the 20s. right? This is when a whole bunch of cigarette manufacturers get aggregated together and called Lucky Strike, right? It was all different tobacco before, now under a single brand. And this stalwart of branding, Coca-Cola, it emerges in the early part of the era, and it emerged from buying out a bunch of bottling companies and then saying, okay, all of this is now going to be called Coca-Cola. We'll put the brand on it. All of this through vertical integration as well. So vertical integration, you remember, it's about getting all the way to the resource, all the way to the market, right? From the mine to the consumer, from the field to the consumer. These companies are buying up huge amounts of market space and putting their name on it, right? Calling them this. And branding and the growth of these companies gave the United States companies increasing power over foreign markets as well. So that's an Armour plant where they put the Armour brand on meat in Buenos Aires, Argentina, right? So it's Argentina beef, but because Armour owns it and branded it, it's got their name on it. Coca-Cola, if the sign is right, and it was sold everywhere. Like everybody began to recognize. Now, they had an advantage, they had an ingredient advantage. Anybody know what Coca-Cola used to have in it? Cocaine, right? And there's still some question about how much cocoa leaf goes into this product. People still love it. But it was originally kind of marketed as a health drink. And then they realized that they could market it as people drink this stuff and feel great. Coca-Cola's been around forever. I drink it because I actually think it tastes good. And so another thing we see here, though, is how even local companies like Russell Motor Car really depend on branding as well in order to push the product. They're pushing a brand through this. So brand identity critical. And in all of these, what we're seeing as well is the rise of print advertisement and getting this message out. Radio advertisement as well. And then we'd see it in the movies as well. Domestic electrification created a whole ecosystem of demand. And this is where we see all of these domestic devices. Thomas Edison's dream of electrifying households finally came true in the late 1920s in urban America, in our biggest cities. And these electric households then created all these new devices. Here we see an electric waffle, a refrigerator, vacuum cleaner. All of them are being pitched as labor-saving devices for women in the household, right? Even the gear you see in the lower right, this is camping gear. It's essentially pitched as a domestic setup that makes camping easier, right? Technologies into the domestic space. And I mentioned last time again that auto touring became a whole industry of its own. It's a thing besides visiting family that most Americans do with their car, and it spawns this whole ecosystem of camping goods to satisfy that urge. So mass production of ores and metals driving the mass production and assembly of automobiles and radios and household devices and all sorts of consumer goods connected to domestic electrification. In the economy, vertical integration is the move of the day from mine to consumer. As much of that market as you can hold, and you brand it, because brands become the identity that people associate with and that companies use to sell their products. All of this creates a growing national mass culture, right? A mass culture around the shared experiences on the radio, around the shared experiences of moving pictures, around shared brands and products, around shared cultural activities. And all of this forged urban America together into this mass consumer culture in the 1920s. A mass consumer culture where you could identify your social position by the brands that you possessed, by the things that you bought and the things that you own, and by your level of consumption. How much are you spending on stuff, right? Remarkably successful economically, right? All of this activity made Americans wealthier. This chart measures per capita income. So how much did Americans on average earn in a given year? And we can see the per capita measure growing steadily year after year. after year until 1929, when it plummets, but then it boomerangs back up into World War II and gets back on track. So pre-Great Depression, right up to 1929, the experience of two generations of Americans, urban Americans, was an experience of economic growth, was an experience of doing better themselves from where they started and watching their children do even better than they did as this economy grew and wealth grew. It was a remarkable economic accomplishment. And it wasn't just about giving somebody a job. It was about these inventions that created wealth and created wealth generating activities. It was about an economy that I think, as the Republicans saw early on when they tried to spawn it forward, an economy that produces real economic growth and real expansions of wealth, genuine expansions of wealth. Now, the period that is circled here is the one we're most interested in for the moment. And one of the things, and we'll get into this deeper in the next unit when we look at this, is it was also built on some economic weaknesses. The wealth that came through the period in that circle, kind of a three-legged stool, a little off balance. So you remember that when Ford went to the $5 day, he did so that his employees could buy the car that they were in the factory making. He did not expect them to buy it outright. $298 was more than anyone could afford at that period of time, all at once. What did he offer them? He offered them credit, right? They'll pay him over time for the privilege of taking that car right away. And they'll pay him a little more over time for the privilege of paying over time. And by 1920, Ford's not alone in this. This is the way in which cars start to get out the American public. GM offers consumer credit or financing on their cars as well by the mid-1920s. And not just cars, radios, refrigerators, vacuum cleaners, all of these expensive new items for the household were all offered with some kind of consumer credit. Consumer credit kind of emerges in this space, and it allowed people to put commodities in their houses, to put themselves into automobiles, to put themselves into things that said, I'm middle class, even though they might not have all the money for that for 5 years, for 10 years, right? They're getting in early. And so it ended up creating a somewhat fake set of economic measures. Now, this is a measure of bank credit, which tells you a little bit about the health of an economy. The peak that you see first is the US debt that was accumulated during war. That's war debt. War debt is good debt in a way. War debt has always been healthy for the United States. We've paid it off, we've gotten back to it. The second peak you see is consumer debt, right? Consumer debt is a somewhat different creature altogether. So the consumer debt essentially suggested that this whole economy is floating upon the fact that you're going to do better next week, that you're going to make more money next year. Things are going to continue to go well. And it's like this balloon that's sort of resting on air, the air being the faith that one has in their future earnings. It's very much a mental thing, that the health of the market itself. And it's a dangerous balance, because the only way you sustain this kind of credit is your economy grows and accelerates in that growth. Otherwise, you're risking somebody not being able to pay back. And once somebody doesn't, the whole house of cards comes flying down, right? And that's what happened until in 1929, was there was so much debt in consumer spaces and there was no money to pay for it. And suddenly you're out of a job, so you couldn't pay the debt next year. And so the bank collapses and it tumbled down. I'll talk about this in that lecture in about a week. And so it ballooned into 1929 until it didn't. You can see the dip right there. And an economy that was built on next year's salary collapses like a house of cards when next year's salary disappears. So we'll get to the Great Depression in Unit 3. In the meanwhile, we don't want to mistake how roaring the Roaring 20s were. this was a renewed sense of wealth. Like until 1929 hit, this growing wealth, these growing urban centers, this modernizing landscape, the cleaning of cities themselves, these new transportation, this growing participation in this mass national culture and entertainment and consumer goods. These brands gave us an identity, and optimism year after year in the 1920s, optimism that next year was going to be even better than this year. And the actual growth in output was proving that this was the case. Things were getting better year after year after year. This was the experience of urbanites in the 1920s. And we'll see in the next lecture how women found this wealth ultimately liberating, right? This is the first kind of 20th century women's libs movement, was because of the wealth that was available for unmarried women. It also provided the wealth that created the economic foundations under the Black liberation movement and the Northern Black culture that would emerge at this point. There was a sense of possibility in the 1920s, and a sense of possibilities that was really seductive and really infectious. Like nobody knew what was coming. It looked like we were in for the good, for the long haul. It appeared that urban modern life had reached a crescendo of success, that in a sense, we'd arrived. But as I suggested, this is one way of looking at what happened. We had, in that optimism, built up a dangerous overvaluation. So there's a 1929 key. This is a price to earnings. It basically is how much are people paying for your stock versus how much is your company really worth, right? You want things in this middle zone and you get a decent economy. It had fallen down after World War II and dropped into undervalued, but then it accelerated through this consumer credit into this enormously overvalued economy. All of the credit, tomorrow's paycheck, and the next one, and the next one were already spent in this economy. And when that future disappeared, it leads to an ultimate collapse. It makes businesses appear to be more profitable than they actually are. And like I said, as long as it drives forward, as long as it grows, everything seems okay. But once it collapses, it's precipitous. And this is all the automobiles and the radios and the refrigerators and all of the things that went into the middle class households. And more importantly, Americans started buying stock on credit. They started buying into the value of the market with money they didn't have. And that was the ultimate weakness in the market itself. Very delicate situation. I will pay you tomorrow for a hamburger today. The other thing we have to notice here is that this whole boom, this whole success was exclusively urban. Right? So we remember the farmers. This is a chart of wheat prices. They plummeted right after World War I, 1919. We'll remember the farmers and the rural workers who tried to organize the Populist Party in the late 19th century. These same people who were then asking for favorable policies in Washington and failed to get political power are still marginalized in this era. They don't have a voice. Urban people like cheap food. Cheap food is good for urban people. Cheap food is not good for rural people. They're not getting the money for their produce, right? And so there was a disharmony between the needs of the region. And in this era, just like the 1890s, rural America was left out. You see the wheat prices collapse after World War I. They just continue to fall. By the time the Depression came to the rest of America, rural people were like, we've been at that for 10 years. It's nothing new to us. The other thing that was holding them back was electrification was strictly urban. All rural people were left out of the whole electrification advancement. So they had no electrical domestic life, and it doesn't reach out to the nation's farms until the 40s, right? And then through the 1920s, while the flappers and the stockbrokers and the new car owners and the Ford workers are experiencing more and more and better, and their houses are becoming filled with consumer goods, and Americans are feeling optimistic and hopeful, out in the countryside, farms are getting foreclosed like crazy. Farmers are finding themselves unable to pay their bills, unable to pay their mortgages, and eventually just being driven off of farms. We see a consolidation of small farms in this period into large bank investments because people cannot afford to farm. So it was bad for farms in rural America. And we can say that by the end of the 1920s, there were two distinct Americans. There was this urban national culture, this Ford driving, World Series watching urban culture that was hip and up on the latest movies. And there was rural America, which was unelectrified, which was not connected to all of these advances. They could barely support their families, and they could barely maintain this way of life, which was still kind of imagined to be where Americans started as rural farmers. The rest of the nation would catch up to their fate by 1929 when the whole inflated economy came crashing to the ground. But for the 20s, rural people were left to their own suffering and to their own misery. I want to look at one other thing, two other things here. One is, we'll also notice the same thing happened. So we're looking at copper prices here. That bottoming out of the copper prices is indicative of what happened to miners in a sense. So not only farmers, but miners are seeing lower prices out. So rural production isn't a part of the economic miracle of mass production, even though it's feeding it altogether. And then the last thing I want to look at is the federal debt in this whole mix. And we'll look at this chart a few times. So we can see by the end of the 19th century, the federal government, remember those agencies that start getting at it? The federal government's willing to hold more debt. It's becoming larger. It's willing to hold more debt by the end of the 19th century. But it has mostly paid down the Civil War, the same way it mostly paid down the Revolutionary War. And it shouldered about the same amount of debt for World War I, on par with war investments. And it appears to be on track to pay off the World War I debt faster than either of the other two, right? So as we come to the end of this period, we have more government presence in the economy, but what appears to be a return to the normalcy of a fairly small federal debt and a fairly small federal presence. We'll see that paradigm transform in the next unit. But for now, we'll end here. Next time, we'll look at African Americans, women, and Native Americans in this period, and we'll end next Wednesday with a look at the political changes in this period. I'll see you guys on Monday.